So, what caused the Civil War? Well, everything that caused the Civil War revolved around slavery. Some might argue about states' rights or expansionism, but slavery was really at the core of all of those arguments. We see slavery to be the elephant in the room during all of the compromises in the 1800s. The first government issue of slavery emerges included in the Missouri Compromise of 1820. This compromise, just like many others, were done in order to make both pro-slavery and anti-slavery people happy. As Missouri was becoming a new state, people started asking the question of whether it should be a free or a slave state. The Missouri Compromise was drafted and said that Maine would be free and everything south of the Missouri border would be a slave state. This was done in an effort to maintain a balance of free to slave states, and it worked well in briefly calming the tensions between the North and the South. Henry Clay is a big name to mention here. He was known as the Great Pacifier. He's a big name here because he's one of the main guys who not only drafted the Missouri Compromise, but also the upcoming Compromise of 1850. The Missouri Compromise was the first major Northern ideas versus Southern ideas debate over land and rights. Attempts to make a compromise were known to only be temporary solutions. The compromise ended up showing that there are only two types of states and their rights would be opposite. One would be free and one would be slave. We also see the government start to split here, with people picking sides of whether they are on the side of slavery or against it. Moving to Texas. Texas rebelled against its owner, Mexico, and wanted to become part of the U.S. in 1837. The U.S. government said no, because Texas wanted to be a slave state, and the U.S. government didn't want to disrupt the one-to-one free-to-slave. After being put on the back burner, though, we annexed Texas as a slave state while simultaneously obtaining Oregon from the British as a free state. These had a border at the 49th parallel. James Polk is now president, and after seeing that acquiring Texas went well, he has his eyes on California, which Mexico owns. Polk sends troops to a disputed border of Texas and Mexico, looking for a fight. Mexico has cut off everything between the U.S. and Mexico, knowing that he's only trying to start something. Polk says, "Can we please buy it off you?" And they're like, "No, go away. It's not for sale." The troops don't go away, though, and cross the border. Because of this, one of them ends up getting killed. Polk is furious, thinking that this is an outrage, and asks Congress if he can have permission to go to war. Congress granted him this because he said that they shed American blood on American soil. And yes, it was American blood, but it was definitely not American soil. War ensues with Mexico, and we end up winning. Mexico, though, still isn't ready to throw in the towel with us. The U.S. responds to this lack of towel throwing by capturing Mexico City. This is soon followed by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended the war. This means that Polk succeeded in what he wanted. With a win over Mexico, we got Texas, California, and several other territories. Obviously, all of the things happening were thoroughly debated throughout their happening. The debates were first about war and what was happening with the territories in Texas, but as the war finished and we acquired the new land, the debate shifted from what was going to happen in this new land, specifically to the is slavery going to be happening in this new land. The Compromise of 1850 decided what was going to happen with all the new land acquired. It said that California would be free, D.C. would abolish the slave trade, but only the trade of slaves. Everyone could keep their slaves that they already had. Mexico and Utah had the right to popular sovereignty, and while popular sovereignty is a law, it still isn't used until 1854. With all new territories, it's up to popular sovereignty to decide whether slavery is legal. It also completely removed the Missouri Compromise. A big part of this compromise is that popular sovereignty showed that the federal government wasn't in control here when territories become freer slave states. Popular sovereignty also increased sectionalism, because the government is saying to the citizens, hey, we have a ton of new land that no one's living on, except for natives, and it's up to you people to decide who has more of your side of slavery of support there. The Compromise of 1850 also strengthened the Fugitive Slave Act. Because of the strengthening, abolitionists got more upset. The act said that if Northerners helped an escaped slave, jail sentences and fines could be given to them. Bostonians, also known as abolitionists, saw how unfair the Fugitive Slave Act was to free slaves and were upset that they were being forced to act as marshals. In response to the Fugitive Slave Act, Uncle Tom's Cabin is released in March of 1852. 10,000 copies of the book are sold in the first week, and 300,000 copies are sold in the first year. It ends up being the second best-selling book of the 19th century, and that's just second to the Bible. The reason it was so popular was because it added depth to the abolitionist movement. It made one's views on slavery a moral issue rather than a political one. It was no longer a what you're saying is wrong, instead of it was a you as a person are wrong. With the Compromise of 1850 strengthening the Fugitive Slave Act and Uncle Tom's Cabin being a household book about how wrong slavery is, it wouldn't take much for Northern abolitionists to be pushed too far. This line was crossed for them with the Burns and Sims cases. Burns and Sims were both escaped slaves that fell under the wrath of the Fugitive Slave Act. The Sims affair was first, and didn't cause much of an uprising because the Bostonians were scared about the fines and prison times that the Fugitive Slave Act promised them if they helped the slaves. The second that Sims was on the boat home, everyone knew that they had made a mistake in not standing up for him, and were going to do more in the future. Soon after came Burns, an escaped slave who was being put back into slavery because of the Fugitive Slave Act, just like Sims. The abolitionists realized that after the first time they messed up that they couldn't do it again. Once the issue happened with Burns, they responded with force. Because of this, they got fought back by U.S. soldiers. The government wanted to prove that they were going to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act no matter what the Northerners do. The North is now thinking that the government is for slavery, which doesn't make sense given that they're representing the people. But with both abolitionists and the U.S. government not standing down, tensions start to run high with citizens thinking that there needs to be a change in government. The Kansas-Nebraska Act happens next, which causes the country to completely polarize. This act links expansionism issues with difficulty compromising with more sectional tension. The act really made the issue of slavery into a polar argument, with citizens and politicians deciding which side of the argument they were on. The decision to use popular sovereignty in all the new states destroyed the Northern Democrats that were on the fence and made them into Republicans. Popular sovereignty was more of a theory on how it should work in the slave states, rather than how things actually went down. Northerners really didn't like that this was the rule, but it was okay because it hadn't been used for 4 years after it was enacted. 4 years later, and the North has to remember that this was their agreement when it is solidified by the Kansas-Nebraska Act. They're much more upset about it now, though, because it's actually being used. This is also known as the North is cut by a knife, and while it was healing, the South rubbed salt in the wound. Anyways, Stephen Douglas comes out on top as the leader of the Southern Democratic Party. Douglas wants a railroad to go from Illinois to California, but needs Southern support. He also wants to run for president in 1856. He thinks the Louisiana Territory should be split into two parts, Kansas and Nebraska, and popular sovereignty will decide whether the lands become slave states or not. This decision appealed to the South. We'll be learning more about him soon, though, when his beef with Lincoln starts. Meanwhile, there are three types of people going west. People that are pro-slavery, people that are anti-slavery because of moral reasons, and people that are anti-slavery because they think that slaves will take their jobs. and within those there are the three groups involved in Bloody Kansas. Border ruffians, who are just some people from Missouri that were fighting for pro-slavery. The radical abolitionists, which are like the Free Soilers and didn't like slavery, but the radical abolitionists didn't want slavery anywhere. They were just against the idea of slavery because they thought it was morally a bad thing. And then there were the Free Soilers. These people really didn't care about slavery as a larger topic. All they wanted to have was their free land. They were concerned that immigrants and slaves would take their land and their jobs away from them. As long as slavery wasn't happening in their state, they were happy. And everybody is bringing their guns to Kansas trying to win popular sovereignty. Kansas becomes bloody because everyone is fighting who can get control via popular sovereignty. Meanwhile, in Washington, Charles Sumner gets clubbed. Sumner made derogatory remarks against Senator Andrew Butler. Preston Brooks, the nephew of Butler, attacked Sumner with a cane. This showed that the fighting from Kansas was being brought back to the government. Now it's the mid-1850s and the debate of slavery is at its peak. With the sectional divide with the Kansas-Nebraska Act and discussion about the legality of the Missouri Compromise, which was challenged by the Compromise of 1850, a civil war as an answer is starting to present itself. One of the final nails in the coffin was Dred Scott, who was a Missouri slave who sued his owner for his freedom because they were living on free soil. But he was defeated 7-2 in court. The court had to answer if Scott was a free man if he's on free soil. Are slaves even citizens? Do they have the right to sue in federal court? Does the federal court have the right to decide about slaves' decisions and what to do with slaves? Because this got brought to the Supreme Court, they showed that not only was the government into slavery, but so is the Supreme Court and the judicial system. It also showed that someone could buy a slave in the South and bring it north and still have it be a slave. This means that there's really no such thing as a free state. Now it's Lincoln and Douglas debating for a seat in the Senate. Though the fight was for the Senate seat, both really had their minds on the presidential election that was going to happen in 1860. Abraham Lincoln was a lawyer and served in the House of Whig Party, but failed to be reelected there. He went back to being a lawyer, but got attracted to politics again when he disagreed with the Kansas-Nebraska Act as a Republican. Stephen Douglas developed the theory and was the founder of popular sovereignty. He played a major role in passing the Compromise of 1850, and he was one who bargained with the South to have the Missouri Compromise repealed in the Kansas-Nebraska Act. He lost the presidential elections of 1852 and 1856, and wanted to run in 1860, but needed a seat in the Senate. The main issue of debate was slavery, and how it related to expansionism and the constitutionality of Dred Scott and popular sovereignty. Lincoln and Douglas both wanted to make each other look like extremists in order to seem too crazy in the swing states like Illinois. Lincoln made himself seem a little more racist than he is, and Douglas made himself seem a little less racist than he is. And even though they're arguing for the Senate seat, both really had the presidential election in mind. This didn't work well for Douglas because he seemed too wishy-washy for the extreme Republicans and didn't get their vote in the presidential elections. The abolitionists didn't trust his blurred-line views on "I'm totally not a racist." Douglas did win the Senate, though. Lincoln, on the other hand, had this all work out for him in the long run. With having the Goldilocks of the racism situation, he seemed just enough racist and just enough abolitionist to win the election of 1860. During the election of 1860, Lincoln got actually 0 votes in 9 states. Some states were unhappy with the fact that he was president, and soon after many states seceded and fighting between the North and South broke out. This was the start of the Civil War.